All right. Good. Thank you very much, Stefan. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening. I understand we're in 13 different time zones. So welcome to all of you for this short presentation that I'm titling, Can We Make an App for That? Valuing Lawsuits with Bayesian Lab. So I'm assuming that most everyone here is not a lawyer and may not be familiar with lawsuits at all, and you don't need to know much about them. I will try to tell you what I think you need to know. So on October 12th, a construction company was removing a man lift from a construction site, and as the truck that was pulling this trailer turned the corner, it flipped over. So they called a wreck recovery expert, Henry Sheldrick, who came and, among other things, unhitched the man lift from the trailer and was standing there for maybe 30 seconds or so when suddenly the trailer flipped over, threw Henry on the ground. He shattered his left elbow, which led to 16 surgeries, permanent disability, and over $350,000 in medical bills. So after recovering from that, he found his way to a lawyer, Georgia, who took on the case to sue the construction company for damages. And Frank is the defense counsel for the construction company. And in the course of the litigating the case and preparing everything, documents, answers, motions, and so forth, it emerges that defendant is saying, well, we didn't have a duty to Henry Sheldrick, but we weren't negligent. And even if we'd had a duty and we were negligent, nothing that we did caused the harm to Henry. And moreover, he was more than 50% contributorily negligent anyway, so we're not liable to the plaintiff. So the case proceeds through discovery and some motion practice and gets to the point of mediation. And when the parties show up at mediation, Georgia says, well, $2.5 million will settle this case. She's thinking $100,000 would be a pretty good deal. Frank says, are you crazy? We won't pay a penny more than $25,000. He's thinking, I hope we can get this done for at least $75,000, maybe less. Georgia says, we'll come down to $2.3 million, but we need significant movement from you too. Can't you get serious? Frank says, we'll come up to $40,000, but that's our last offer. Doesn't she see the problems with her case? We're out of here. Call me when you decide to make a serious offer. I guess they just can't be reasonable. So they leave in a huff. Stupid defendant, stupid plaintiff. Why do Georgia and Frank bargain like this? Well, there are many reasons, but some of them are cognitive impediments, and those fall into three different buckets. One is cognitive biases such as confirmation bias, overconfidence bias, sunk cost bias, recency bias, saliency bias. There are several things that screw up our cognitive abilities. Uncertainty, who's going to be the judge? How long will we have that judge? What will the judge decide? Who's going to be on the jury? What kind of people will be on the jury? How will the evidence come in? Will we get all of the witnesses we want? And so forth. So uncertainty is a big factor. And then there's the issue of complexity, just keeping all of the different factors that affect the outcome of a lawsuit in mind simultaneously and dealing with them. So I want to focus our conversation on the complexity issue and how it relates to lawsuit valuation. So in order to win, Georgia must persuade the judge that the case can go to trial. She has to win on summary judgment. And I'm not going to explain what all that means because we don't have the time for that, but she has to get past that hurdle. She also has to prove, if she gets past that hurdle, that the defendant had a duty to plaintiff, that the defendant breached that duty, that the plaintiff was harmed, that defendant's negligence caused defendant's harm, and plaintiff's own negligence did not cause the harm by more than 50%. Frank wins if he can persuade the jury to rule against plaintiff on any single element of liability. So she has to prove everything. He has to prove only one thing, or prove that at least one thing wasn't proved. But from Frank's perspective, he has to keep in mind that the jury might sympathize with the plaintiff. And if defendant loses, the damages could exceed $2 million. So it's a pretty big roll of the dice for Frank and his client. And win or lose, defendant must pay its own legal fees, which could exceed $100,000. This is an important factor in valuing the risk or estimating the risk of a lawsuit and computing the value. We'll come back to that. The plaintiff subtracts its legal fees from any recovery. The defendant adds its legal fees to any payment it has to make to the plaintiff. And win or lose, the defendant has to cover its own legal fees. So Georgia simplifies this complexity by focusing on the potentially large damage award if she wins the case. And that's why she's saying $2.5 million will settle this case, even though she's willing to walk out of there with a fraction of that amount. Frank, on the other hand, simplifies by looking at the challenge of proving causation as well as the comparative negligence problem, and thinks he will win on liability. They're like two of the blind people in the famous parable about the six blind people and the elephant. They see and focus on part of the big picture, but they don't see and cannot keep in mind all of the factors that are relevant to the decision they're trying to make. So I want to talk just briefly about the valuation and risk assessment of a future asset, an asset that becomes valuable in the future. So an oil field, for example, it will become valuable in the future, but only if the people who are trying to drill for oil have the right to do so. There's oil under the ground, which they don't know yet. They think there is, but they don't know that yet. They can extract the oil cost effectively. So they have the means to take the oil out and do so cost effectively. And finally, the price of oil will be high enough to justify all of the cost, will exceed the cost. Any of those factors, if they miss them, they won't have a successful oil field. Similarly, with a startup business, it's a similar kind of situation. For a startup business to succeed, there has to be a product or service that is as good or better than any competitive product available on the market. The team that's developing this product has to do so competently. They have to execute. There has to be sufficient money to pay for the expenses before there's any revenue coming in. So the capital investment has to cover all of this. So the team has to find the money. And finally, the most important thing is there has to be a buyer out there who will actually buy the product or service that's being developed. You lose on any of those, and the business is going to fail, which may be why 80% of startup businesses don't succeed. Well, there's a similar thing with valuing a lawsuit. If you're the plaintiff or the plaintiff's lawyer, you're trying to figure out how valuable is this lawsuit, or whether it's worth taking on a contingent fee basis. Or if you're in the litigation finance world and you try to figure out, does it make sense to finance this lawsuit? Then you need to go through the factors that I mentioned a while ago, and all of them, you have to meet all of them. So it's something like going to a slot machine in a casino. If you, to win, you have to get 4 of any of the items that's shown here, 5 of those items showing up at once all the way across the row. So if it's cherries, you have to get 5 cherries. 4 cherries is not enough. 4 cherries, you lose. You have to get all 5. So that brings the issue of compound probability into the discussion. So let's assume that there's a 5% probability of getting cherries on any particular run of the slot machine. That would mean that there's probably 20 different icons on each wheel, and there's a 5% chance of any particular icon showing up on any particular turn. So what does that mean in actual practice? That means that you have to multiply 5% times 5% times 5% times 5% times 5%, and you get a number that's so small, I don't even know what the word is for it. This is the scientific notation for it. I don't know how small that number is, but it's very small, and that comes as a surprise to a lot of people. Lawyers are in particular, but not just lawyers. So remember that Georgia has to prove all of these elements. She has to get past summary judgment and then prove all of these elements shown here. And if she misses any, she's going to lose, just like with the slot machine. If she gets duty, breach, harm, and doesn't prove causation, she's going to lose. So in terms of the math on that, if you lay that out, most lawyers, by the way, don't do this. They don't even think like this because they don't know to. And I suspect that most of us who are not familiar with this don't do this for big decisions. So let's say there's an 80% chance of surviving summary judgment, 85% chance of proving that there was a duty, 95% chance on breach, 100% on harm, and 20% on causation, and 35% chance of surviving the contributory negligence issue. So what does that add up to? Anybody want to take a guess? Well, write down a number that you think that adds up to. What happens is many lawyers, if you talk to them about this, they'll say, well, I have a 20% chance of winning the case, because they will focus on the lowest number, 20%, and say, well, that's my real problem here, but I've got a 20% chance of winning. When actually what they have is a 4.5% chance of winning. If all of these numbers are correct, if these estimates are good estimates, then there's a 4.5% chance of winning the case. That comes as a shock to lawyers, at least in my experience, when you reveal that to them in, for example, a mediation. So let's do that again. Let's say, well, we'll revise those numbers and we'll increase the probability on duty and also on causation and contributory negligence. So what do we get if we change those numbers as I shown here? Well, in that case, you get 20%, but the numbers have to be pretty high all across the board except for causation for you to get even 20%. Well, let's do that one more time and say, what would you get if you had really high numbers all the way across the board? 90% on 3 of them, 100% on 1 of them, and 85% on each of the remaining 2 factors that you have to prove. So what does that add up to? Again, anybody who wants to take a guess at this, please write a number down. A lot of lawyers think that that's a slam dunk. I've got better than an 85% chance of winning this case. Well, not so fast. What that really adds up to, if you do the calculation, is 53%, which coincidentally turns out to about the personal injury base rate, which means that if the cases that don't settle, that are in the personal injury category, and about 95% of cases do settle. I'm not sure whether that number is correct for personal injury cases, but across the board, most cases in the United States settle by voluntary agreement. But those that don't, in the personal injury world, if they go to trial, the plaintiff has a 52% chance of winning, which means it's a coin flip. You might as well just flip a coin because that's what your chances are. So what if Georgia and Frank had a tool to manage the complexity, at least this part of it, the compound probability part? So turns out there's an app for that, and I developed it. And the way I did was I started off using work by Mark Victor, who's been in this field for decades. He used decision trees to manage this complexity. And I started off working with decision tree technology as well. But I found that it was really unwieldy and opaque. It's very difficult to see what's going on with decision trees that have any complexity, and a decision tree for a lawsuit almost necessarily has to be complex. So I looked around and I said, is there any other way to do this? And I developed a tool called the Case Value and Risk Analyzer using Excel software. So I'm going to give you a very short demonstration of how it works, and then talk about what we might do with it in the Bayesian environment to make it better. So Georgia is using this tool, and the first thing she does is click on step 1 over here on the left. And when she clicks on that, she gets the opening page for plaintiff's data input and summary page. And the only place she can input information is in this column of gray boxes on the left. So she starts off with liability and comparative negligence, and she enters 15% as the probability that defendant will win summary judgment. She puts in 20% as the liability, possibility that she'll prove liability at trial, 25% on comparative negligence, and then she starts filling in the damages section. So there's 3 numbers she has to put in here with the probabilities for each, and that means that she puts in the medical expenses as a low number, medium number of 900,000, and if she hits a home run, then that'll be 2.5 million. Over on the right-hand side of this page, the numbers start filling in next to the description rows that say what each is. And those numbers will change as she enters more and more numbers. So right now, the projected net recovery is shown as 23,000, and the net present financial value after appeal is 14,000. But that changes because she puts in more numbers. So as she puts in the numbers for damages, those numbers will change. And then when she enters the cost through trial, which is legal fees and legal expenses, those numbers will change yet again, and they will go down on the plaintiff's side because of the fact that plaintiff has to subtract costs from any recovery. This section here that's showing has to do with what would be her biggest expense if, or maximum loss if she lost, and maximum win if she won. And then there's a section that deals with settlement analysis based on the current demand and offer by plaintiff and defendant. So once she's finished working through her side of the tool, she will come to the defendant's data input and summary page, which I've already filled out. And the idea here is for her to say what she thinks defendant would put in these various categories, how the defendant would complete this. And when she does that, she sees that the defendant's net present financial risk using these assumptions on the left is $162,000 after the appeal. So there's a big spread here. And what's showing right now is the summary page that shows side by side how these two sides of the case compare with each other. And what happens is anybody who's using this tool can see that there's a big spread between what the recovery is for the plaintiff and the risk for the defendant. And that gives rise to a zone of potential agreement the midway point of which is about $85,000. So a reasonable settlement here would be somewhere in the $85,000 range. And the tool allows anybody using it, so the plaintiff's lawyer, the defense lawyer, the mediator, the client, to see that kind of thing. And it also allows for quick adjustments. So what if instead of 20% chance of winning, it was 40% chance, and you can do that sort of a what if analysis all day long. So I showed this, I've used this in my own practice as a mediator, as a lawyer, as a consultant to lawyers. And I was giving a talk on this and presenting this tool to a group of high-level litigation lawyers at the American Bar Association one year. And at the end of the talk, during the discussion session, one of the lawyers in the back raised his hand and said, "Can I pay you not to show this to plaintiff's attorneys?" So he clearly saw the value of it. And many others have commented on how valuable this tool is. And indeed, I believe it's quite a useful tool. But I want to focus on one of the features of it that sometimes is missed and is very important. And that's the dual view aspect, the ability to see both how you see it and how they might see it. So you remember the movie Tootsie, where Dustin Hoffman played a woman in a soap opera on television. He was an out-of-work actor, and he got this part. And he, as a result of doing that, he was able to see how women experienced a world in which there was a lot of male dominance and male bias and prejudice. That gave him a new perspective. There's a tool that we use in mediation and other dispute resolution contexts called the ladder of inference. And the purpose is to help each of us see how somebody else different from us might see things. So the way it is you go up perceptions, sense-making, beliefs, and so forth to understand their point of view. So let's say there's this picture of rods here at the bottom. One party sees 4 rods and the other sees 3. And what happens is we typically negotiate about conclusions. And we try to badger the other person and say how stupid they are because they don't see that there are 4 rods there. And they likewise think we're pretty dumb because we don't see that there are only 3. And if we go through the process of seeing what their perceptions are, how they made sense of them, how they reached the beliefs that they do, the biases that came into play, and how they got to the conclusion, then it's difficult to see why they're not stupid and why we're so brilliant. So the dual view case evaluator that I've just described helps us do that. It helps us walk in their shoes. And that's valuable for the settlement negotiation process. But wait, there's more, at least more to talk about. So the idea in a lawsuit, the theory is that there are 2 things that are allowed in a courtroom or a trial. One is the admissible evidence, and the other is logic and reasoning. So those are the only 2 things that are theoretically permissible in a trial, in a courtroom. You're supposed to exclude bias, prejudice, and anything that could corrupt the evidence, like leading questions, hearsay, outside publicity, and the like. But in fact, jurors bring with them biases and prejudices, and they bring them into the jury box. So you get a jury box populated with people who have various biases and prejudices, and we all do. And not only that, but the judge has her biases and prejudices, as do witnesses. And all of this cognitive material, this stuff, this biases and prejudices, affect the trial. So instead of just evidence and logic, you also get in a courtroom biases and prejudices. And that makes it much more difficult to understand what's going to happen in a in a trial. So you may remember the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. If you remember the courtroom scenes in there, you will have seen prejudice and bias on display quite graphically, both on the part of the judge, on the part of various witnesses and lawyers, and certainly in the jury. So one of the things that I'm getting to the Bayesian network aspect of this, one of the things that we have in trying to figure out what's going to happen in a lawsuit is various factors. So we have the plaintiff's lawyer's legal skills and the defense team's legal skills. We have the judge's level of competence, how good the judge is in processing and managing a lawsuit, and the jury's ability to assimilate the evidence and weigh it and understand what's really going on, which is not always even. Then we have all of the evidence on all of the various elements of a lawsuit, including damages. And then we have the eventual verdict, which flows from all of that. And we have, as I just mentioned, biases and prejudices. So that gives us a fairly large amount of different factors to keep in mind. And again, we have this complexity, and it's just physically impossible for the human mind to keep all of this kind of information in mind simultaneously. We cannot do that. So what we end up with is a set of causation relationships that flow back and forth among all of these players and all of these factors. And that gets us a very complex picture that includes what I haven't mentioned before, the group dynamics of the jury, how they go about deciding something. So you can't manage that with the case value and risk analyzer, because the case value and risk analyzer doesn't give you the ability to do conditional probability assessments. And the updating is a fairly crude way of going about updating. So I developed something that was an add-on to the existing tool that gives us the ability to at least take into consideration the legal skills of the lawyers and various other factors. And it's useful. It has some benefit, but it's certainly not sufficient. So that leads me to the question of, can we develop a Bayesian network with Bayesian Lab that would help us take into consideration the various factors and their relationships and what happens when things change and as they do. So I should mention that lawyers are natural Bayesians or intuitive Bayesians, I would say, at least litigation lawyers. And it's my own view that all human beings are intuitive Bayesians, but certainly lawyers are, because the process of a lawsuit is you go from a high degree of uncertainty to a lower degree of uncertainty. You never get to a full certainty until the absolute end of a lawsuit, which can take years to get to. And then you know what the result is. But until you get to that point, there's always a level of uncertainty. But lawyers are continually updating their view of a lawsuit by virtue of new events, new information, new evidence that's discovered, how a witness testifies, and so forth and so on. A Bayesian network model that is developed for the purpose of assessing a lawsuit could take all of that into consideration. So one of the things that's critical here is the estimates that go into the tool. So if you have bad estimates, you're going to get bad results in terms of, what's the likelihood, what's the probability that the jury will find the defendant's negligence caused the harm that plaintiff suffered. If you estimate that at 80% and it's really more like 15%, you're going to get a really skewed outcome. But similarly, if you have great estimates, you're going to get a really valuable result that you can use in your decision making. So one of the things that will help us in that, there are various things that help get better estimates in this context, but one is using subject matter experts. So the idea here is instead of one lawyer looking at the case and making probability assessments, let's get 5 with different backgrounds. And maybe 3 will be usually plaintiff's lawyers and 2 will be the defense lawyers, and they bring their different perspectives and expertise into the process. So it turns out that Bayesian Lab has a tool for that called the Bayesian Expert Knowledge Elicitation Environment. And it's one that I've, ever since the first time I learned about it, was several years ago, I've always been very excited about and would really like to put to use in this context. So I guess I should say a word about why it's cost effective why it's important to engage in cost effective lawsuit resolution. So if we were all in the same room, I'd ask people to raise their hands and say, how much do you think litigation costs the for-profit business world? And we'd get various estimates, and most of them, I think, would be somewhat low compared to what it actually is. The average Fortune 200 company spends an amount equal to 1/3 of its profits on legal claims. Now, that's not 1/3 of all of its revenue, obviously. It's if they have $100 million of profits, they spend $33 million in legal fees and claims, payment of claims. So what that means is 1/3 of money that could go to the bottom line goes into garbage. There's no benefit to any corporation from a lawsuit, other than perhaps let's not do that again. But it doesn't advance the mission of the corporation one iota to be a defendant in a lawsuit. And a plaintiff in a lawsuit as a corporation, that's fairly uncommon. It's not all that rare, but corporations that are plaintiffs, that's unusual. So the money goes to different places: contract disputes, labor and employment disputes, regulatory investigations, patent claims, personal injury claims, product liability, and so forth. But it all goes out the door. So the cheapest way to add value to a company is to prevent and properly manage legal claims. So if we could get rid of most of that expense, that would go directly to the bottom line. So the question I have is, can we make an app for that? Well, we already have the one that I made, and I've mentioned that it's good, but it's not good enough. It doesn't do all that we could do. So you could create a case value and risk analyzer for a smartphone or an iPad, basically using what I've already done. But if Frank had something like that, he would see, hey, $85,000, that'd be a pretty good settlement for us and for them too. I'll share this with the mediator, and so they avoid this breakup at the end of the mediation where they all walk out in a huff. Now, I am not an expert on or proficient at constructing Bayesian networks or using Bayesian Lab for that matter. I've attended the introductory Bayesian Lab course. I've read most of Judea Pearl's book on the Book of Why. I've worked through Fenton and Neal's book on risk assessment, decision analysis, and so forth. So I have, I would say, an introductory or preliminary understanding of this area, but I can't do it myself. I don't have the skills, and I'm not proficient in it. So I'm looking for someone to help. And if you are interested or know of somebody who would be interested to work on building an app with Bayesian Lab for this kind of decision making, I'd really I'd like to hear from you. So I'm going to stop and take questions, and hopefully you have a lot. And thanks for watching.